How to Read Poetry Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster.
Interlude. Is verse ever really free? In the early 20th century, a term came into the literary lexicon that had never been uttered before. Free verse. There were poems here and there that qualified as free verse, or at least as someone making pretty free with verse. Predictably, the French rode this new wave. Some of their 19th century versifiers of the symbolist stripe, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, Jules Laforgue, started horsing around with poems that broke out of the customary patterns. Then there was Walt Whitman. He didn't so much reject received forms as establish his own, using as a model the Psalms of the King James Bible, themselves efforts to imitate Hebrew poetry. His example led the way for modern poets to ignore convention, because he had given them a new, if unconventional, one. If you want someone to break rules, find an American. To understand this odd term and somewhat odd practice, let's clutter the field with two more. In the beginning, there was closed-form poetry, which is to say poetry with pretty strict rules. You know, rules like, thou shalt end the line after 10 syllables, or rhymes shall occur at the ends of lines at predictable intervals, or thou shalt have no form before this form. But you know what poets are like. Obstreperous bunch. Make them follow rules for 6 or 7 centuries and they get restless. Maybe even decide that rules are made to be broken. What would happen? Someone might ask, if we loosen things up a little, maybe worry less about iambs and trochees, have lines of different lengths. What if we write poems, another might ask, more like music and less like rhythmic machines? Except that one isn't theoretical. Ezra Pound didn't actually ask it, but rather stated it in a retrospect. Along with co-conspirators Hilda Doolittle, better known as H.D., and Richard Aldington, he came up with 3 rules for the new poetry, circa 1912. Number 1, direct treatment of the thing, whether objective or subjective. Number 2, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. Number 3, as regarding rhythm, to compose in the sequence of a musical phrase, not in the sequence of a metronome. And by metronome, of course, he meant received meter. Out with marching iambs and trochees, in with more sinuous rhythms. What if those questions got answered? What would it look like? What would we call it? One thing to call it, in opposition to the term we just employed, is open form poetry. It's a good, solid, useful term, but like most things good, solid, and useful, sort of dull. Nothing like free verse. Nobody can resist free. Not shoppers, not victims of scams, not theorists, and certainly not young poets who have been feeling constrained by conventions and rules. It's just that, how free is free? At the extremity, free verse is simply prose. No rules, but any sort of musicality or compression is lost in the looseness of phrasing. And no one can say, a priori, how closely free verse needs to stick to metrical verse in order to be, well, verse. There's the crucial word, verse. We're not talking about free expression or free association or free speech. It's free verse, the latter word balancing the former, keeping it in check just as the first extends the possibilities of the latter. T.S. Eliot, sounding more like a building contractor than a poet, expressed the matter directly. No verse is free for the man who wants to do a good job. William Carlos Williams added a similar perspective when he said, being an art form, verse cannot be free in the sense of having no limitations or guiding principles. Even Ivor Winters, that great curmudgeon of American poetry criticism, gave the form its due when he said that the free verse that is really verse, that is, the best of W.C. Williams, H.D., Marianne Moore, Wallace Stevens, and Ezra Pound, is the antithesis of free. In each of those statements, the emphasis falls on the last name of this new form, or constellations of forms, really, for every poet's free verse, and to a large extent, every individual effort is a new form, with no other example being quite like it. That's all well and good, but what makes it verse and not merely free? Rules. The difference between this modern innovation and traditional poetry is that the rules come from inside. A poet may, as we have seen with Marianne Moore's The Fish, employ a strict syllabic arrangement of her own making, and even if she uses syllabics in her next poem, the chances that she will use the same pattern of syllables per line or even the same number of lines per stanza is something approaching zero. Why go over the same ground again? I once heard the singer-songwriter Mary Chapin Carpenter say that every new guitar tuning suggested a new song. So, too, with rhythmic arrangements, every new one occasions a new expression, a new poem. If E. Cummings chooses to emulate the rapid fire of a revolver with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that, he has to decide why 5 shots and not 6, as well as why pigeons just like that makes more sense as a single word, and why the two portmanteau words are separated from each other by a space. Whatever the size and shape and arrangements of lines in free verse poems, the writer shapes, limits, and controls what she can say with every decision she makes. We do a disservice if we fail to notice those decisions, or if we read the result as a mere prose that has been chopped into lines. In each of these cases, the limitations, while self-imposed, resemble the old rules by forcing the poet to find the music in the measure. This is the thing that eludes Robert Frost when he says that writing free verse is like playing tennis with the net down. It's really more like playing tennis with a net you wove yourself. Don't misunderstand. There are a blue million poems out there claiming to be free verse that are merely sloppy, undisciplined, self-indulgent, and lacking in coherent rationale as to formal principles, if any, which is also true of closed-form poems. The world is chock full of terrible writing, which will always overwhelm the other stuff, and not just by unknowns. My copy of E. Cummings' Complete Poems, 1904 through 1962, is so huge that it could be used as the counterweight for a trebuchet. Its weight could be reduced by 40%, at least, by removal of the experiments that went awry. The reduction in scale would reflect a net gain for poetry. On the other hand, there are long stretches of the Prelude and In Memoriam A.H.H. that Wordsworth and Tennyson could have neglected to write, with no resulting damage to the works. And yet, we wouldn't list any of these poets on the second string. Their work is magnificent, most of the time. Quality in poetry is never a reflection of the chosen form. It's far easier to write a lousy sonnet than a great one, and lousy is all most of us could ever achieve. But we don't blame sonnets when a bad example crops up, nor should we blame free verse for the poor examples we discover. Poetry is poetry, free or not. It is good or not in each iteration, each individual poem. We can read, analyze, judge, welcome, reject, celebrate, and appreciate only the poem itself, not poetry. And really, would you want it any other way?